Hello, everyone, and thank you all for attending our sixth and final day of the Ethiopia Modern Nation Ancient Roots Conference. For today, we have two sessions. The first session, titled Diasporic Ethiopia, Migration and Exile, will begin very shortly, and will be moderated by Professor Dagmawi Wobshet. The second session is a keynote speech by Assistant Professor at the University of Chicago, Adam Getachew. I would just like to mention a few housekeeping details before we begin. The duration of the panel is 2 hours, including the Q&A portion. For all attendees, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions, and we will try our best to answer as many as possible. Please do not use the chat option to ask questions, as we will not be utilizing it for any Q&A, and your question might be missed. For fellow participants of the conference, please note that you have the option to enter the Q&A portion of the panel to ask your questions using audio and/or your video. To ensure a smooth process, please utilize the raise your hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and the moderator will call upon you to present your question. I would also like to inform you that this webinar is being live streamed on YouTube to increase access for countries that do not have access to Zoom. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the panel. I would like now to introduce Professor Dagmawi.
Thank you so much, Satan. Good evening, everyone. Good morning, good day, wherever you're tuning in from. This is the last day of our week-long conference, Ethiopia, Modern Nation and Ancient Roots. The first session today is titled Diasporic Ethiopia, Migration and Exile. And we have a fantastic group of speakers lined up this evening. Now, briefly, before I introduce them, I'm glad that this is, migration is one of the topics that we've chosen to feature as part of this conference. Because as we all know, migration profoundly shapes our past and our present. From the dispersal of early humans to the mass flows of people today, migration defines the very contours of human history and shades our sense of survival, longing, and belonging. The economic, political, and cultural formations of the modern world indeed rest on the mass movement of people from one place to another. Migrants, be they forced or voluntary, documented or undocumented, domestic or international, permanent or temporary, have transformed the character of modern geopolitical boundaries, nation states, cities, and civilizations. Furthermore, our contemporary era is defined by unprecedented levels of global migration, with more people than ever living outside their place of birth. And we'll see this evening from our distinguished speakers different interpretations of this theme, and looking at the different divergent, overlapping experience of diaspora Ethiopians. Our first speaker is Dagmawi Yemer, who was born and who grew up in Addis Ababa. He left the country after the 2005 post-election unrest, in which hundreds of people were killed and put in prison. After a long journey across the Libyan desert and the Mediterranean, he came ashore on the island of Lampedusa on July 30th, 2006. In Rome, after participating in a video workshop in 2007, he co-authored the film Il Deserto e Il Mare, The Desert and the Sea, along with 5 other migrants. Subsequently, he co-directed the 2008 documentary film Come un uomo sulla terra, Like a Man on Earth. He shot the documentary Cara Italia, Dear Italy, in 2009, and Soltanto il Mare, Nothing But the Sea, in 2011, along with several other short films. Coordinated the collective film project Benvenuti in Italia, Welcome to Italy, in 2011, and the documentary that hopefully we've all had a chance to see, that's been on the Africa Institute website, Va Pensiero, Walking Stories in 2013. He directed the film Asmat Names in 2015, among his many works. Dagmawi is the co-founder and vice president of the Archivio delle Memorie Migranti, Migrant Memory Archive. He also teaches courses in schools and universities on visual storytelling and migration in cinema. Thank you so much, Dagmawi, for joining us.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Sihin Tafarra, who is the founder of Setawit Movement, an Ethiopian feminist network that works for gender equality and justice. Setawit Movement works to articulate Ethiopian feminism and to question normative masculinities and femininities through public dialogue, research, and activism. Setawit's latest project is Alenta, a hotline for survivors of sexual and domestic violence. Sihin represents Setawit on the advisory board of the president of the Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, and she is a member of the Destiny Ethiopia initiative that aims to reshape Ethiopian politics. Sihin obtained a PhD in gender studies from SOAS, University of London in 2015. A Mo Ibrahim scholar, Sihin has authored most recently a chapter in in a volume titled Feminist Parenting, Perspectives from Africa and Beyond. Welcome, Sihin. And last but not least, our third speaker is Professor Asnak Akafale, who holds a PhD in political science from Leiden University, the Netherlands. He is Associate Professor of Political Science at Addis Ababa University. His research interests include migration, international relations of the Horn of Africa, federalism and conflict management, and development policies and practices. A prolific author, some of his recent publications include SHOATs and Smartphones, Cross-Border Training in the Ethio-Somaliland Corridor, published by the Danish Institute. Another publication, Federalism and Regional Politics in Africa, which appeared in the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Politics. Shopping for Ideas to Unlock Africa's Economic Potential published in the Africa Review of Books. Remittance and Household Socioeconomic Well-Being in the Case of Ethiopian Labor Migrants to the Republic of South Africa and the Middle East. Another essay, Ethiopian Labor Migration to the Gulf and South Africa. And Regional Organization and Security Governance, a Comparative Assessment of IGAD and Aswan, published by the London School of Economics and Political Science, to name a number of, just a few of his numerous publications. Professor Asnaka, thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you.
All right, so this is the format of our discussion today. So it's a panel, but what we'll do is for the first panel, I'm gonna join my Mokshe Dagmawi in conversation. So each speaker will have about 20 minutes. So for the first 20 minutes, Dagmawi and I are going to engage in a conversation, and then we'll go to Sihin and then to Professor Asnaka. Okay, Dagmawi, I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be in a conversation with you. And as I mentioned to you, it's a shame that we don't have the full hour to discuss your just incredible, powerful body of work, and also the film that you are so generous to share with us, Va Pensiero. So as the description, I'll just quickly read the description, and then I'll ask you just a handful of questions. So Va Pensiero, Walking Stories, for those of you who haven't had a chance to see it, is an interwoven account of two racist attacks in Milan and Florence, and the victims' painful attempts to piece the fragments of their lives back together. In central Milan, Mohammed Ba, a 50-year-old Senegalese griot, actor and teacher and resident in Italy for 14 years, is knifed in broad daylight on May 31st, 2009. And in Florence, residents Moore and Sheikh, also immigrants from Senegal, are shot at on December 31st, 2011, while working in the San Lorenzo market. This powerful account brings together their overlapping stories of the protagonists' ordeal and their enduring hope of building a life in Italy, despite the fear and uncertainty of suddenly being plunged back to the moment of the attacks by one look or gesture. The director, Dagmawi, a refugee from Ethiopia, shows us what violence looks like through the eyes of the victim. Okay, now to our conversation, and I'll just say that was all introduction, so our 20 minutes actually starts now. Dagma, I want to begin by asking you a general question. What made you decide to make this film? I mean, there are countless stories of African immigrants, particularly in Italy, facing violence and constant xenophobia. So how did you choose the stories of the three central characters in your film, Mohammed Ba, Mosogu, and Sheikh Mbengu?
Well, thank you, Mokshe, Dagmawi. First of all, I have to thank the African Institute for having organized this meeting, this conference. I have been following the whole week, and special thanks for all the scholars, Ethiopian scholars like you and Surafil Wandimmu and Elizabeth Georgis. Thank you very much. Coming back to your question, I appreciate that you have mentioned the three names of Mohammed Ba and Morsugu and Sheikh Mor, Sheikh Mbeng. And these are the reasons why I wanted to film the stories of three persons who otherwise would have been forgotten as numbers, even though they were victims, and the local media did not talk about their stories. So I wanted to talk about their singularity and of their names and singularity of their stories. This is why I didn't choose the story by myself, but I met accidentally Mohammed Ba one day just after he was released from the hospital. But I knew few stories about him, that only a Senegalese stage actor has been stabbed in Milano. And this was an informal information that I have received. And the day after that, I have heard this story of a stabbed migrant. I met accidentally Mohammed Ba in a conference. And what intrigued me to film and shoot his story is not the fact that he was stabbed, but the fact that he is the griot. I didn't know that he was such an exemplary person who can really be a voice for many migrants, because he has the talents and he has the personality. And it would have been a pity having losing him, because 5 millimeters from his hurt, the knife that stabbed him stopped. He would have died without knowing him. And that's why I wanted to film his story. But while I was following Mohammed Ba's story, the episode of Florence happened. And I wanted to include the story of Mor and Sheikh in the film, because, as I mentioned it before, the local media didn't talk about their life, who they were. They remained simply 3 Senegalese killed and 2 wounded. And that was the notice of the day, and that made me a little bit angry, because the journalists were very interested in who was the person who the attacker. or the person, the racist one, they gave him a real incredible profile, who he was, his name, his surname, and where he lived, and what was his political opinion, and none has been said about the migrants, the More and Sheikh and others who were being killed and injured. So this is how the film started. I included the story of More and Sheikh while I was filming Mohammed Ba's story.
Wow. I mean, one of the things that was so captivating and something that I found so powerful is how the film captures the individual, right, experience of these three, and how also the violence, the experience has impacted them not the same, in different ways, but also how during the course of the hour, during the course of the film, the camera pans repeatedly to show us many more Africans in the streets of Florence and in the streets of Milan, and the kinds of labor they engaged in as street vendors, and the possible violence that they may face. So I'm wondering if you can say more about how the film balances the individual stories of these three characters, but also the collective African migrant and experience, and also having witnessed the story of the three, the violence that has already occurred, but also the potential violence that can happen in any instance.
Yeah, it's a good question, because what I tried in the film is also to show the contrast between the beauty of the cities and the ugliness of those violence, and the monumental beauty, but also the violence of those two cities, Milan and Florence. The same beauty that generates income for the migrant and the city is not immune from being provoking violence to the migrants, or at the cost of African migrants. So their vulnerability is that being undocumented. I want to tell you maybe how precarious the migrants' situation in Italy is, or the street vendors. Maybe I didn't mention Mor Diop, who was dead in this attack in Florence, but he has a story, a dramatic story, but because he went away from Senegal while his wife was expecting their child, and he went away, and the baby girl grew up, and she was 8 years old when he died, and she received his body and never had the chance to meet him, to talk to him, or to hug him. And this is how the economical and legal precariousness of the migrants is also one of the aspects of what is happening, or what happened to those people who work on the streets. And the other thing is to give also justice for the beauty. The beauty is not only the architectural beauty of Italy, but also the reaction of the manifestation that you have seen, where the Florence and its province, they went out to denounce and against the racist attack. That is also one of the beauty I wanted to show. On the other hand, the other beauty is the wedding ceremony of Chiara and Mohammed in a church, with a mixed ritual ceremony. That is also another beauty, another response to what the ugliness of the violence has shown on these bodies, on this black body. Did I answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, just if I may follow up, because as harrowing as the story is, as deeply affecting as your film is, it's also just beautifully shot. And as you mentioned, we get, especially in your transitional shots, we have these just exquisite, kind of iconic shots of, say, Florence, for instance, with, you know, the Brunelleschi Dome and the Arno River. And then at the end of the film, this breathtaking dance that hundreds of birds, a flock of birds dancing in the sky. And as you rightly say, there was something about that beauty of the city, for instance, of these two legendary cities that's mocked or belied by the experience of racial violence. But when you started to make this, I'm curious how, again, that's also such a delicate balancing act in the film. And maybe if you can elaborate that point.
Yeah, this is also because my point on that film is to completely ignore what has been talked about, the incidents, and talk about what Mohammed Ba, Mor, and Sheikh have to tell me, and not to manipulate their story. This is what was my position. And in that moment, my freedom was only to combine or to bring the parallel beauty of the city, which is also the same place where people have been experiencing the violence, which is the postcard image of Florence cannot necessarily be detached from those violence that the protagonist has lived. So this is also to show how complex it is when we describe a city or a beauty of a place without the inclusion of the migrant, because those are the places where a lot of tourists come, and the Senegalese street vendors are also involved thanks to this beauty. Either the city or the migrant itself is the beneficiary of the. While I was the swallows that you have seen at the end of the closing moment or the closing scene, I didn't go to that roof to shoot the swallows, and you have to be always lucky when you are a filmmaker. I was there to film the city, but I found those swallows beautifully moving, and I knew while filming that is going to be the closing. I did have the title, and I did have the closing of the film, but not still the story. That was how it went, and the rail, how do you call it? The hadith, where the way to communicate the story from Milan to Florence, because it was too difficult and too different. The Mor and Sheikh are different from Mohammed Ba. Mohammed Ba itself has two characters in it. We see Mohammed Ba as a griot, who is the storyteller, who can talk about the transatlantic slavery and also what blackness means in Italy in the present day. And there is also Mohammed Ba that we see as a person who is a father, who is an educator, and who is also a victim. So it was a little bit complex to unite Mor and Sheikh as their own character, not actors like Mohammed Ba, to unite these stories. Do we have to unite them because they live the same experience, or is there something else that can be traced to unite these stories from two cities? So the railroad that I have filmed was the way to coming in and going out from one story to another. The movement of this rail and the experience, the first experience of Mohammed Ba, who tells about his first arrival in Milan and how he experienced his point of view on Italian society was also the way that helped me to use the train as a echo.
But I mean, it makes for just the craft. It's visible how well crafted the film is. But you mentioned Muhammad Bani gets me to my next question, because at the very outset of the film we see an excerpt of Muhammad Ba's solo theater performance titled "Invisible," and I love how both of you, if you will, become narrators of the film. Muhammad as a griot and you as a filmmaker. And in his performance, he contextualizes his own migrant experience as a Senegalese who moved to Italy 14 years ago within a larger historical context of the transatlantic slavery and colonialism, the dehumanization of Black people then, and the continued dehumanization of Black people today. So can you say more about how these two types of storytelling that take place in the film, the tradition of the griot and the tradition of cinema, and how they give texture to the story of migration?
Yeah, it's a good occasion for me having met Mohamed Ba. It's not about telling a story of a migrant, but telling a story of a migrant who is already on the process of telling stories like Mohamed Ba is doing. So this combination, of course, who is a filmmaker and who knows what it means filming actors knows how much difficult it is to film actors, because they are always on a performance moment, and you hardly find them while they are really living their life. Because at the time you have the video camera in front, they are automatically ready to change their being, and being the one who should interpret, or the one who should be correct in front of the video camera. So it was challenging working with an actor. It's not easy, because if you want to find out the person behind the actor, you have to wait. You have to wait till midnight. Maybe the interview that I did for him, he was exhausted, he was tired, and the last words that he has spoken were powerful, and his voice was really authentic and not as an actor. And I wanted, to show how Mohamed Ba is much more than a victim, a person who is trying to go out from that story and start again his daily task to work on the intercultural dialogue. And I am proud of him, because in some way he is a storyteller, and he is happy. This is a good thing to do as a filmmaker, and this is my principle, is to, before finishing the film, I always show the film to the person who generously shared his story. And by the time he accepts that the film is worth closing it, then the film is ready to be shown on the public. So that's how we collaborated.
Okay, I'll ask one more question, and then we'll turn to our other two panelists. There's a powerful scene, and it comes rather early in the film, where Mohamed Ba is in the classroom, because he's an educator, also a performer and an educator. He's in the classroom of very young children, maybe 5 or 6 years old, who engage him about his Senegalese identity with curiosity as kids are wont to do. But then, cut to the next scene, the children's parents barrage him with all types of stereotypes of being a Muslim, and in fact begin to sing in a joyful manner, Facetta Nera, Little Blackface, a fascist era racist marching song. And you can tell, I mean, he's disturbed by it, right? And this is clearly a song, from the fascist era that's been passed down generations through the generation for these women to know it intimately. They know the lyrics, right? And I kept on wondering, sadly, the young kids, their own children, would soon grow up to sing that song and lose the kind of curiosity, right? And openness they have with this, with Muhammad. So maybe just to give you this occasion, if I may ask you, if you want to say more about the scene, but more generally, how anti-Black racism is passed down, it's a multi-generational affairs, passed down from generation to shape today's Italian culture.
Yeah, it's a huge question, because I think Italy has never elaborated its colonial past, and that is what you have seen on the scene of Facetta Nera, is that shows you, gives you a glimpse how the story or the colonial history has been or hasn't been elaborated, or didn't even have existed, unless this romanticizing the colonial era. Because in Italy, one of the problems you might have, or everybody here would have heard about Affile of Graziani, how they celebrated him in his native country, and there is such kind of from one part an ignorance, because that generation is an expired generation. The mothers are already, and the kids who listen to Muhammad Ba's intercultural meetings or education are much more ready to accept each other, because in that class there are a lot of kids from migrant background. So the question about Blackness will definitely change from this, from what the mothers are have in their mind, because from the other side, or other point of view, is that Muhammad Ba is not the Muslim for them. He is a friend, and he is the person that to whom they are giving their child, so that he can educate them. So they don't see the Muslim, they don't see the migrant, they don't see another person, rather they see Muhammad Ba. And the other funny thing is that I always wonder if at my place, if there was a white man with a video camera to do a reportage on for the national TV, would those mothers would be as open as frank as they are now? We have seen them, or they would have been politically correct and careful? I don't think they understand how disgraceful is chanting Facetta Nera. They are not aware of what they are doing, or maybe they don't feel that they are offending somebody. Maybe it's those spectators or the audience who is sensible to that is much more shocked to hear those stories. Rather, it would have been common among some places in Italy. So.
Okay. Well, we can go on for hours and hours, Dagmawi, but for time's sake, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And next we will turn to Sihin Tafarra, whose paper is titled Ahun Lene, The Praxis Between Agency and Discipline in Ethiopian Women's Repeated Migrations to the Middle East. Sihin, you have the floor.
Thanks, Daggy. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
The connection on my laptop is not good, so I'm actually doing this on my phone, and I hope it would hold for a few minutes. I'd like to thank the organizers for this really great lineup, Daggy, Surafel, and Elsie, and of course the African Institute. It's been a really great few days. So my topic is the repeat migration of Ethiopian women to the Middle East. And as a little preamble, I'd like to remind everybody of this very graphic image we have of one of the first acts of the Prime Minister was he went to the Middle East a few weeks, I think, within after his inauguration to rescue back a group of migrants, and he even traveled back with them. And these were migrants who'd overstayed their visas. And it really grabbed the national imagination. So my research around this is based on this argument that despite that very dramatic action of bringing back some of the Ethiopian migrants, migration has in no terms really changed since then. And Ethiopian migrants, according to the IOM, leave Ethiopia at a rate of something like 1,000 migrants a day. A little bit of background: Ethiopia gets more money from remittances than it does from foreign aid, something like $4 billion. So a huge factor in our economy. Although there's definitely human trafficking, a lot of the migration is voluntary, or it's on a continuum. It's a voluntary migration / trafficking continuum. A lot of the migrants are actually men, although we're focusing here on women. And almost all migration happens for economic reasons, something that Bina Fernandez calls the will for change. So in Amharic, we keep hearing the term I want to change my fate, my life, my economic situation, so I'll migrate. So the research for this took place in terms of an economic / development research for something called the Hotspots project, looking at safe migration. So it was a qualitative study and in-depth interviews with 35 returning migrants, all of them repeat migrants to the Middle East, 78% Muslim, the rest Christian. And the interview.
Okay, let's do this. Let's turn to Professor Asnaqa, and then we'll come back to Sihin at the end. So Professor Asnaqa Kafala, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Addis Ababa University, Ethiopia. The paper's title is Ethiopian Labor Migration to the Gulf Countries, Motivations, Recent Trends, and Policies. Professor Asnaqa, you have the floor. You're on mute. Professor. Asnaqa, you are on mute.
Okay, yeah.
There we go.
We're all learning how this thing operates. Okay, thank you so much for the kind introduction. My paper is about labor migration to the Middle East in broadly. It includes several countries, including the Gulf Cooperation Council members, primarily Saudi Arabia. Just very brief ideas about labor migration to the Middle East from Ethiopia. First, we need to realize international migration from Ethiopia is one of the lowest in comparison to the sub-Saharan average. For many years, the rate of migration was about 0.7, whereas in the rest of Africa is 2.5%. So still, there is a low rate of outward migration from Ethiopia. But in the last 3 decades, since the beginning of the 1990s, there has been a spike in outward migration from Ethiopia. In the last several years, tens of thousands of young people leave Ethiopia. Particularly, the major destinations are the countries of the Middle East and also South Africa. To the Middle East, every year, tens of thousands of young people leave, including women. Primarily, the majority of the migrants are men, but increasingly there is a feminization of migration from Ethiopia. Conceptually, it's very difficult to have a precise word or concept to characterize migration from Ethiopia. There are many concepts which are being utilized. We have irregular migration versus regular. Irregular migration happens because the majority of the migrants do not have travel documents, they don't have visas or work permits. Whereas we have also documented regular migration, particularly since the end of the 90s. Women working as domestic workers in the countries of the Middle East, and also men, even if the share of the men is lower than women, we have also documented migration to the Middle East. We have also migrants, we have also refugees. So it's a combination of several kinds of migration. We published in 2000 a book, a small monograph with a colleague on labor migration to the Middle East, and we decidedly took the title of labor migration to the Middle East and South Africa, particularly to the Middle East, even if like the legal characterization of the migration is not yet certain, but many of the Ethiopian compatriots who go to the Middle East, the purpose is to work. Either they have the documentation or not. The purpose is not to get asylum, to get refugee protection. Rather, they want to go to the Middle East. And Sin was saying the single most purpose of migration is what the prospective migrants say, to change their lives, to change the lives of their families. So that's why we decided to use labor migration. There is labor migration which is documented. There is labor migration which is not documented. The figures are staggering. There is this regional bureau of mixed migration in the Horn of Africa and Yemen. From 2008 to 2016, more than 365,000 migrants arrived in Yemen, in spite of the civil war, in spite of several socioeconomic health problems in Yemen. Such a large number of people arrived in Yemen. And according to these statistics, more than 80% of the migrants were from Ethiopia. So you can see the staggering amount of people moving from Ethiopia to the Middle East. Why? There are, I'm going to come to the motivations. Now also the COVID pandemic is bringing a new dynamics to regular migration. We have seen these harrowing images of Ethiopian domestic workers being stranded in Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and many other places. So it's going to have its own implications, severe implications on migration from Ethiopia to the Middle East. The motivations, I tried to historicize the motivations during the 1970s and 80s. The primary reason for migration from Ethiopia was political because of the violence. Post-1991 period, economic factors appear to be the main drivers, though still there are political and human rights issues. The economic factors appear to be the most important because of unemployment. Ethiopia is a country, a very useful population, over 100 million people. From the statistics, when you look at the statistics of the government, over 1 million young people join every year the labor market. But what the labor market can provide in terms of decent jobs is very much limited. Still, the majority of the youth, the majority of the people are either engaged in agriculture or in the urban areas, in the informal sector. So unemployment is a major problem. There is also underemployment. We did field work in 2010, 11 in several places in the north, in the south, with teams of researchers. The idea like that we have in policymakers and in many researches, people migrate because they are poor. But partly that's not true, because people need some money to save. In some cases, employed teachers, employed nurses, people working as agricultural extension workers, health extension workers decide to leave. So it's a very complicated picture. So underemployment or low pay is also one of the reasons for migration. And a new development, or an important point that we need to emphasize, cultural and attitudinal factors. Going beyond the traditional, these pull and push factors, the youth and the families, local communities are becoming more the agency of the youth in deciding to migrate. One young person who was interviewed as part of that research, he said in the north, in Tigray, there are like some communities where a large number of young people migrate to Saudi Arabia irregularly. He tried to explain why he decided to migrate. He said, I was stuck somehow after finishing school, 12th grade. There was no any way for him to have a decent employment. So he was stuck. So migration is being taken as an instrument for the youth to exit from a place, from a condition in which they have been stuck. So in many communities in Ethiopia, we have this problem, like for the young people, to pass traditional markers of adulthood, to get married, to start their own families, as because of the economic reasons. Young people are deciding to migrate. And in many communities, migration is becoming socially acceptable. Families and communities support those who wish to migrate. In southern Ethiopia, where there is a high level of migration to South Africa, even if the officials teach the adversities of irregular migration, local communities, church leaders organize prayers before young people start their sojourn to South Africa. They give them a blessing. So socially, migration is being accepted. Other factors include landlessness and shortage of land. There is also another factor which is very important when we look at irregular migration to the Middle East. The presence of network of recruiters, brokers, smugglers, traffickers, which are linked up, starting from communities, local communities, starting from grassroots levels, transit countries, destination countries, and also the emergence of technology, globalization, Facebook, and other technologies are utilized. Even the mobile phones are increasingly used not only to facilitate the migration of young people to the Middle East, but also to facilitate the transfer of remittances to the recipient families. Major phases of Ethiopian migration to the Middle East, there were the following major phases. The first phase starting from the 1980s till the beginning of the 1990s, migration, the bulk of the migration happened irregularly, and people traveled in the name of religious pilgrimage, Hajj and Umrah, and they decided to stay. From the second wave was from 1991 to 1998. In this period, the majority of the migrant workers went to Lebanon to work as domestic workers. And the political change that had happened at the beginning of the 1990s contributed immensely to the growth of migration, because the EPRDF government allowed the issuance of travel documents. In the past, it was not possible. And also the EPRDF was generally more pro-migration. It also tried to gain advantages from the diaspora communities in terms of remittances. But when it comes to treatment of benefits, or the way the government sees labor migrants who travel to the Middle East are at the lower hierarchy. The policies tend to privilege migrant communities, Ethiopian migrants, or the diaspora communities in North America and Europe. From 2012, starting, there was this change starting from 2012. There was a very high increase in terms of documented labor migration to Saudi Arabia. In 2012, about 200,000 Ethiopian domestic workers went to Saudi Arabia. Why? Because the Philippines government decided to ban the travel of Filipino migrant domestic workers to Saudi Arabia. The Ethiopian government decided to take the vacuum, to fill the vacuum, saw it as an opportunity. But 2013, which everybody remembers, there was this crackdown by the Saudi government. More than 160,000 Ethiopian migrants were repatriated. There were a number of things, atrocities. As a result, the government of Ethiopia banned migration. But the banning of regular migration helped increment of irregular migration, because the government stopped documented migration of domestic workers to the Middle East from 2012 till 2018. But that period also saw a remarkable rise in the number of people who migrated to the Middle East. Remember the figures that I mentioned from the secretariat that follows irregular migration from the Horn of Africa to Yemen. Now, the government Ethiopia put two new legislations in 2016 and 2018. Two legislations were put. These legislations are going to govern labor migration to other countries. One of the requirements is a very good step forward. Before Ethiopians are allowed to travel to work in other countries, there should be a bilateral agreement between the government of Ethiopia and the recipient countries. A bilateral agreement has been signed between Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Jordan. But the ban was lifted in 2018. So regular documented migration was about to peak in 2019, 2020. Now COVID brought its own dynamics. Because of COVID, as you all know, international travel, including migration, is increasingly difficult. Another point which is very important to look at, the working conditions of Ethiopian migrant workers in the Middle East, problems of protection. One thing which really complicates when we studied labor migration to the Middle East, which really complicates, is the lack of distinction between regular and irregular labor migration to the Middle East. Migrant workers in the Middle East are not as such given protection. Many of the Middle Eastern countries have not ratified or they have not incorporated international instruments that provide protections to migrant workers to their domestic law. The problem is even worse to domestic workers who work in the households of families, even if there are like many cases in which violations of their rights or criminal offenses happen, the authorities do not have that much strength to follow. So there is not that much of a distinction between documented migration and undocumented migration. Once they arrive there, even the documented migrants might leave the place where they work and go to other places. Another major hurdle is the protection of the rights of migrant workers in the Middle East is what is called the kafala sponsorship program. The majority of the countries of the Middle East use the system. According to the system, a migrant worker is tied to the sponsor. It's up to the sponsor. In some cases, the sponsors even detain the travel documents of the migrant workers. So a major problem that we have in the Middle East is lack of protection to both regular and irregular migrant workers. Socioeconomic impacts of migration, remittances at the national level. Remittances, the last few years, we used the National Bank of Ethiopia's reports. Remittances have outperformed exporters. Close to $4 billion was secured in 2015-16. And still, I think that is the case. Probably COVID is going to bring its own dynamics. I don't know. We expect a major decline in terms of remittances, not only from the Middle East, but also from North America and other countries. COVID would have its own implications. Migration has also several benefits at the household level. We visited many families in northern Ethiopia, southern Ethiopia, who were able to get out of destitution because of remittances coming from the Middle East, remittances coming from South Africa. So they have like immense impacts at the household level. Many children are able to go to schools because of remittances coming from migrant workers. So at the household level, and also in some places, they build their assets, they start income generating activities. In some places, it has also negative consequences. It creates disputes within the family, how the money is going to be shared. In some places, it creates also dependency. So the picture is of mixed character. It has positive and negative impacts. Migration, irregular migration, and even documented migration has negative psychological impacts on the returnees. The returnees have several problems to contend with when they come back. They have also difficulties to get integrated into the society, the community, start a new life. So it has some adverse consequences.
You have about 2 minutes. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes, I'm coming to the conclusion. Historically, yes, migration has some benefits and also some challenges. Migration, looking at the population structure of Ethiopia, it served as an important outlet to young people who were not able to have decent jobs, but it has its own implications. At the recipient countries level, there is lack of protection to the migrant workers. Usually this thing operates because as far as there is the demand for migrant workers, the migrants are going to travel to these countries. One major conclusion that emerges from our studies, it's important for countries like Ethiopia to devise migration policies, migration laws, which are going to help reduce irregular migration and promote documented and safe migration to the Middle East. Ethiopia cannot do this by itself alone. There must be the cooperation between the recipient countries. And also we need to have a voice at a global level. Globally, when wrong things happen to migrant workers in the Middle East, there is not that much of a voice. If anything bad happens to Europeans or Americans, there will be criticism, outcry in the international media and others. And also sending countries, not only Ethiopia, the Philippines, other countries, Malaysia and others need to talk among themselves in order to strengthen the regime of protection that migrant workers receive in those countries. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you so much, Professor Asnaka, for so clearly laying out all the different features and elements that make up contemporary Ethiopian migration, particularly to the Middle East. So now we will turn back to Sihin so that she can come in and give us her presentation. I believe we're going to link her through the phone. So Satan, I will turn it to you.
Yeah, she's here. Sihin, can you speak, please?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Sihin.
Very sorry for the internet connection issues. So I'll just start where I stopped, which was the theory that I tried to engage in with this research. So I looked at the Foucauldian principles of discipline developed by Michel Foucault. And as you know, Foucault's sectoral research was really around prisons and schools and factories, and the idea that human beings learn to discipline themselves with the help of surveillance. But he also talked about domestic service as a form of discipline. He actually referred to it as a constant, total, massive, non-analytical, unlimited relation of domination established in the form of the individual will of the master. And Foucault also developed the idea of docile bodies, bodies that function in factories and ordered military regiments and school classrooms, and bodies are kind of a new way of understanding particularly gender relations now. Foucault was talking about them in the late 1970s. So all our findings within this research really indicate that European migrant domestic workers experience a social and personal disciplining of themselves as a means of engaging with their employment. That's how we have means of surviving their time there, but also maximizing what they can get out of it. And I'll place this in terms of three thematic areas of discipline. One is communication, the second is movement, and the third is personal dress and hygiene. And lastly, I'll talk a little bit about some of the ways in which domestic workers resist the power that's placed over. In terms of communication, the main area is obviously language. When they first go, migrants really struggle. There's mutual frustration vis-a-vis their employers in not understanding the language, and obviously the repeat migrants that I spoke to had an advantage in that they learned Arabic very well, very quickly, and this helped their skill, made it a lot more pleasant, made it a lot more effective. But also, it was interesting how communication also intersects with gender norms, because it wasn't just language, but often it was understanding what was expected of them in terms of communication, where the direct line was almost always with the madam, with the female employer of the household, and their interactions with men would not only be limited, but it was also very strange to many of the migrant women what was expected of them in this regard. Some of the returnees I spoke to described living in a household for 2 years and not seeing the man of the house at all, or kind of only seeing his back as he left, or only hearing the voice. So very rigorous gender segregation, and also kind of being tested by the madam, by the woman employer to see if the domestic worker was flirting or being overly friendly with the man of the house. So that was something that the migrants learned to circumnavigate. Technology played a role on this, and of course, Michel Foucault talks a lot about this, about surveillance being a tool of discipline, and the women would find out after being employed for a few months that there was a camera in the house, and that all their actions were literally being surveyed. So this is interesting. Technology was also really a key site of discipline, in that a mobile phone was considered really an essential asset in terms of migration, and many of the women had no mobile phones or access to phones while they were there, and some of the community members that we spoke to described not knowing whether the children they sent off to the Middle East were alive or dead, because they hadn't heard from in a couple of years. And there's complicated reasons for this. The access to technology, and particularly to mobile phones, was really a type of discipline. A second thematic area in terms of discipline was the restriction of movement, and Professor Asnagat was just speaking about the kafala system, where migrants are tied to their employers, legally speaking, and this really restricts their ability to leave the house, because their passports would be confiscated, but also movement within the house. Some migrants described access only to a part of the house, and not being allowed to go upstairs or downstairs, as the case may be. And one migrant talked about being locked inside the house with the children and not having access to a mobile phone either, really worrying how should reach the parents if something were to happen to the children. So quite extensive forms of discipline in terms of the restriction of movement. Where we find the most common form of self-discipline was actually interesting, in that sometimes it wasn't imposed by the employers, but it was self-imposed by the women, and that had to do with sexual harassment and assault, which is quite a common experience. So many of the women would refuse to sleep in rooms without locks in them, because it was quite common that the man of the house or a child or visiting relative would come and try to force them to have sex. So locking themselves, which is really kind of self-regulating their own freedom of movement, was quite common across the board. Thirdly, an area of self-discipline or discipline imposed from outside was regarding personal care and hygiene, and this is really big for many of the women. And here I refer to Foucault's understanding of the body as a type of discipline. So as far as Foucault's concerned, the body regulated in order for it to be productive. That's the whole point of it. So the women experienced regular health checkups and being treated as very carefully in terms of being given separate crockery and cutlery for meals, and being taken to the hospital at the slightest sign of illness. Again, really regulating their body for economic purposes. The type of personal discipline really enforced by employers' reactions, but also the women's own efforts. Menstrual health and menstrual hygiene and how women handle their bodies around that time of month was something raised by many of the women. And obviously it's a feminist issue, and it's interesting from that perspective as well. So here I'll just read you a quote from one of the returning migrants that I spoke to. She said, the Arabs consider Ethiopians dirty. It's because some Ethiopian women, particularly those who migrated from rural areas, don't know how to use or dispose of sanitary pads. They don't know how to put it in the garbage after they use it. And some of them put it in latrines and a cloaking system. So So this is a 23-year-old returnee. So personal discipline around menstrual health was a big issue. In terms of personal care and hygiene, dress was again another factor, because obviously this is a very gendered field. For the women that I spoke to are domestic workers, but in people's homes, and navigating what's expected of was often tricky. The head coverings that a lot of the women were expected to put on was fine for many of the returnees, because they're Muslim and they wore hijabs in Ethiopia as well. But it was a bit more difficult for Christians, for the Christians that we spoke to. And some of the Christian returnees that we spoke to said they pretended to be Muslim while they were there. One said she has a cross tattoo on her forehead, but would kind of go through the rituals of praying when she was migrant domestic workers, and when her employer asked her if she's Muslim or Christian, she said she was a recent convert to Islam, and that it made her employer happy. So again, all forms of personal self-discipline and the Foucauldian terms, understanding of the terms. So lastly, I'd like to talk a little bit about resistance, because obviously where you have power, you have resistance, as discussed by Leila Abulugold, and power. And it doesn't really reside outside of power relations; it also resides within. And that was indicated by our findings as well. So a lot of the women, they learn, particularly the refugees, migrants we spoke to, they learn to combine balancing of feelings and assertiveness. So they would often all say that it's really important to listen and try to understand their employers and what they wanted, communicate well with them, to hold oneself, with cleanliness and all the other kind of expectations that we spoke about, but also to combine this with assertiveness. And also the combination of humility, be humble, and be patient, but also be confident. So that was interesting. And they also talked about holding up their own dignity. And don't tell them your personal story. Don't tell your employers your personal history, or don't try to become friends with them. So that was interesting. Where I saw a similar combination of different traits of women, combining different traits, was in my doctoral research on sex work in Ethiopia. So a similar kind of navigation of the performances of humility, combined with actually being quite strong and confident. And within this, you also have some migrants who've had good experiences in the Middle East, and particularly as repeat migrants, and they've used the money for good things, and it's been a good experience for them. There's a tendency for those kind of women to blame women who've had bad experiences with the argument that, well, nothing bad happened to me, so that person must have done something to bring it upon herself. Such arguments. I think I'll stop there and handle questions and answers. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sihin. I hope everyone tuning in can gather from the three different perspectives. We gleaned such a composite and layered and textured picture of migration from Dagmawi Ymer, the ways in which, personal testimony and artistic response is also, or how we can glean the experience of migration via his film and the testimony from Professor Asnaka. We've seen the broad patterns of migration that are economic, political, legal, and also regional. And from Sihin, has given us kind of a conceptual paradigm of Foucault's notion of discipline, to think about also the kind of the experience, subjectivity, if you will, of migrants' experience. So we have, since I feel like, I mean, I have a couple of questions, but I'll hold off since I've taken up a lot of time early on, and I'm gonna go to the questions that have been posed. The first question we have is from Takala Safa. Takala, do you want to come in to ask your question, or should I read it out loud?
I think you can read that, Dagmar.
Okay, thank you, Takala. So Takala's question is to Dr. Asnaqa. I wonder if you've come across with negative local impacts of migration, as the rural is still sending working labor force. So negative local impact, particularly dealing with rural Ethiopia. And then for Dagmawi, the question is, I would like to understand the perception of Italians, particularly to Ethiopian migrants, in relation with the fact that, you know, given the long Ethio-Italo relationships and the defeat of Ottawa, and also the second Ethiopian-Italo war, how do Italians relate to Ethiopian migrants in particular? So Dr. Asnaqa first, and then Dagmawi. Dr. Asnaqa, can you hear me?
Yes, there was a little bit of network. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Yes, there are negative impacts at the community level. We visited one village in Wollo, where quite a large number of young people migrate to the Middle East, so primarily to Saudi Arabia. And also mothers, young mothers also left. You know, the gender impacts were so interesting. In some places, highland, rural Amara, you know, husband is baking injera and feeding their children, you know. Is it positive or negative because they decided to send their wives away? But when we went to the school, in many of the primary schools, teenage young girls are forced to stay at home and do, because their mothers went to Saudi Arabia to work and send money. Some local communities also, some of, you know, limited communities where there is a large amount of young people living to Saudi Arabia, there are also labor shortages, and also traditional, you know, the way family is organized, rivalries being created because of remittances within the household, even homicide happening, you know, in some places, young husbands who have decided to send their wives to work in Saudi Arabia might have issues with their fathers regarding the sharing of remittance monies. So there are negative.
Okay, Dr. Asnaqa, you've
A lot of negative things.
Oh, you froze on us for a second. Go ahead, please finish your thought.
Yes, yeah. What I'm saying was there are both positive and negative. The negative things, which I've already mentioned, there are also rivalries at the household level. Labor, also young girls are being forced, made to stay at home to replace their mothers, to provide household, to do household chores. In the schools, there is a decline of young girls. Enrollment dropout rate of young girls is very high. In some rural communities, there are labor shortages. So a number of negative things as well as positive things.
Thank you. Dagmawi?
Yeah, regarding how the perception of the Italians regarding the Second World War, Adwa, it's better if we don't talk about it because they don't even, the majority of the Italians don't even remember. Paradoxically, there are a lot of roads and places that has been named after all the cities of Ethiopia, from Dire Dawa to Gondar, Tigray, and so forth. But the common Italian cannot tell you what happened in those time, and there is a removal of this colonial past, of course, and there is also an institutionalized censorship. For example, there is a censor still now in 2020. The Lion of the Desert. You know, I don't know if you know the film of Anthony Quinn reciting or interpreting Omar al-Mukhtar, and is still censored. That the Italian television cannot show it. So this is how much the removal or non-accepting the atrocities that has been done in those periods. And you can see it right away after the Second World War, like the butcher of Libya, Graziani, have been released from the prison just after 3 years of detention or imprisonment. And he was not accused of being atrocious against Ethiopians and Libyans, but he was accused of having created with other higher fascist officials, the Republic of Salo or the Republic of Socialist Italia. And this is strange, because when you go out and ask the kids, let alone the adults, they don't remember the real facts of what happened in Africa, especially in Ethiopia. I hope I answered the question.
Yes. Surafel is next. Sure, do you want to come in to ask your question, please?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for the wonderful presentations. I and Dagmawi met, some years back through this song, Faceta Nera, that was featured in Dagmai Ymer's film. I'm also writing on this film, so I'd like to ask you, Dagmai, about this song. Faceta Nera was sung and widely circulated when Italy invaded Ethiopia for the second time in mid-1930s. And this song is a racist song, but it still circulates in public spaces. So tell us a little bit more about the circulation of this song in public spaces, as it appeared in your film, when white women just singing this fascist, racist song at the face of this, West African Senegalese griot. So please tell us about the circulation of this song at the present moment. Second, my question is, please tell us about Black Lives Matter movement in Italy. And my third question, one line, is how are these West African migrants that we have seen in your film, how are they doing now? Where are they? Thank you.
Okay, I will start by answering the last question. Where are they? Mohamed Bas is still working as an actor and an educator, and while Mor and Sheikh Mor had they had received the Italian citizenship. This is one of the response of the Florence city to grant the citizenship, in order to acknowledge that they do part of the society. So Moren Sheikh, who was a little bit terrified than the other people, he just got a kid some years ago. He went back to Senegal. He doesn't want to go back and work on the street, and he is working on another job. He had another job, as well as Sheikh, who has already a family and he is working and living. The thing that there is another person whom I didn't include in the film, who is paralyzed, who is Mustafa Dieng. He was paralyzed because he was shot, and he didn't. He cannot even speak because the bullet has touched the vein, and he was not able to express what he lived and what he wants. So I didn't do the interview. I did do some filming since he was not able to talk about himself. I didn't put his image just for the sake of the documentary. So he is rehabilitating, and he will be definitely handicapped. He is not able to walk anymore. And this is the situation. Regarding the question about Faccetta Nera, yes, you know the story of Faccetta Nera. Faccetta Nera was to romanticize the campaign towards the war in Ethiopia that has been created, and that song has been censored just after the racial law have been applicated in Italy in 1938, I think, right after the racial law. That music was not only public, but they wanted to erase it from the memory, because the first reason of doing such kind of film was to recruit soldiers and to motivate them to go and conquer the ladies, the beautiful ladies in Ethiopia and in Africa. So once the campaign has finished, the soldiers had occupied Ethiopia, those kind of musics and the racial, along with the racial law, were prohibited or left aside. It's true that the lady on the film is referring, that I didn't include in the film. She was referring that her uncle, who is a big manager in a company, has this music as a calling sound or on his cell phone. So there are figures in the institution who are still romanticizing those periods, like Italians, brave people. There is a book about of Del Boca who talks about how it is wrong that Italians were good people towards Africans, because the big narration from the Italian point of view is that Italians went there to construct and to build and to civilize the Africans, and not like the French and the Englands who went there to torment the population. And regarding I don't know if I have time, Dagmawi.
Go ahead.
There are few movements in Black Lives Matters. I think that was the question. I still don't understand, because the context, Italian context, is a little bit different and a little bit precarious regarding the kids born from migrants do not automatically get citizenship. There is they have to wait 18 years before obtaining those documents or being granted as Italians. So it is a little complicated, and that is the fight that they are doing. This second generation kids are fighting to get the right to be considered Italians, since they are living and they are born here.
Okay, great. Thank you.
May I say something back? Sorry.
Yes.
Okay.
Salah.
So
No,
we have plenty of questions, so I promise we will get to them all. Salah, go ahead.
Simply, I wanted to add something which I think is interesting about this song. Sorry, because I think the reasons also, from what I understood, of prohibiting this song at some point, is because it leads to racial mixing. Yes. And that is definitely anti-fascist rule. And this is kind of echo the French to some degree, but mostly the British, because the British have prohibited at some point in places like Ghana and so forth, they have prohibited marriage or having kids from native women because it kind of disturbed the hierarchy. And it's also in the context of fascism, there's more reason than additional reason, which is racial purity. So I just wanted to add that is the racial laws themselves that Dagmawi talked about is part of that fascist, ideology of against mixing to preserve the Aryan race, but in other colonial forces have done the same because they did something else, which is they enshrined the idea of concubinage as part of the law, that you are allowed to have a concubine, but you're not allowed to marry.
Great, thank you, Salah, for the clarification, the addition. Okay, so next we have Shemelis Bonsa has asked me to read his comment and his question. And the question, Sihin, I hope you can take it up for us. So Shemelis writes, I thank the panelists for an excellent presentation. A comment. He says, a discussion about migration to the Middle East, especially the migration of female laborers, should have a longue durée approach and see the phenomenon as part of a historical long process of labor migration. History is relevant here in understanding the antiquity of migration to the Middle East as a whole, but also the gendered nature of migration and the racialized treatment of migrants. The question is, he says, does politics have a role, and also for Professor Asnaka, but the second question, both of you can take it up. So one question is, does politics have a role in the migration process? All right, and I think he means contemporary formal Ethiopian politics. And the second question is, have you had a chance to interrogate some of the analytical frameworks or assumptions deployed in the study of female migrants, the absence of gender and age as a unit of analysis, that is the focus on boys and young men, for instance, or the framing of female migration around notions of trafficking, sexual exploitations, and immobility, which often tend to deny women agency. So Sihin first, and then Professor Asnaka, if you have something to add, we'll cede the floor to you.
Thanks, Dagi, and thank you, Dr. Shemelis, for that excellent question. Does politics, and I guess Dr. Shemelis means formal politics, that's kind of in the legislation, does that have a role? Absolutely. I think the government has a very smart approach to, and I mean EPRDF plus, EPRDF and now Balsagana has a very pragmatic approach towards labor. They're not in denial that Ethiopia has an excess population that needs to go out and make money and send remittances. There's a lot of talk about women don't need to migrate, they can work here. You know, Bagarus Mellowet, Ichalal, this narrative that nobody really believes. It's everybody knows that labor is really the way to go. There hasn't been enough investment in it. The MOLSA, which is the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, is what's charged with handling labor, and they do very basic trainings for women in preparation before they leave. So it's completely underfunded and it's under-resourced in terms of policy. In terms of the agency / gender as a unit of analysis, I completely agree. We tend to talk about migrants as if they're all men, and it's true that irregular migration is mostly still undertaken by men. Even though the image we have is of young women, it's still young men who migrate in large numbers when we're talking about irregular migration, and that's because it's so completely unsafe. But in terms of regular migration, then towards the Middle East, then you have a rising number of women and young women as at that. So labor migration needs to be studied, obviously from feminist perspectives as well. I completely agree. And again, where I saw a correlation is with my doctoral research with sex work, where a lot of the assumption around this work is that women can't possibly choose to be employed in sex work, and you'd have the same arguments within migration. But obviously, there's agency as well. I completely agreed. A lot of women do want to migrate, try their luck, even when they hear of these horrific stories of bad things happening. But a lot of this is rationalized around faith and luck, and this idea that maybe my faith and luck will be different. But here I would like to caution, because we talk so much about agency, and I've really been guilty of this in my own research as well, but we have to be careful that we're not romanticizing agency too much either, because quite a lot of women are also really pushed to migrate, and these are like 15-year-olds or 16-year-olds, and just as in the same way as we can't really talk about consent if they're in sexual relationships, I don't know how much agency a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old has to migrate. And obviously then it's irregular migration, because legal migration is only allowed for women 18 and above. So we just need to be careful with that notion of agency as well. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay. Well, let me ask the next question, and maybe we can go to Professor Asnaga to take it up first. So Aulos Brahanu asks, please discuss the status of previously completed, besides what you all have discussed today, previously completed, any current ongoing or planned comprehensive analysis assessing the net loss benefit balance to the country of overall diaspora phenomenon when comparing the initial immigration, loss and suffering against the eventual return and re-engagement of the seasoned, educated, experienced, economically well-off and productive diaspora citizens within the Ethiopian homeland, including the billions of dollars in annual remittances transferred by the country to the diaspora from nearly every corner of the world. So some of which you all have answered, but if in the question, if you think there's something that you want to tackle.
Thank you. Well, politics is at the heart of migration, both in Ethiopia and in the countries of destination. We're looking at, in our first study, why the countries of the Gulf are allowing a large number of people to come to work within their households. And a political economy analysis was suggesting there was this bargain between the citizens and the governments of the Gulf countries after the oil boom. At least even the citizens could have a share of the oil boom, and they were allowed to have workers. So politics is at the heart. And in Ethiopia also, politics, the role of politics cannot be overlooked. In the past, prior to 1991, the government had absolutely anti-migration policy. Movement of people within the country and outside was prohibited. But after 1991, the government has allowed people to migrate. But by and large, even if there are political causes for migration, by and large, there are economic drivers, in our view, which explain the migrations of a large number of people out of Ethiopia. And politically, migration is not given. Yes, the government appreciates the diaspora. There are even policies, even there are like directories. There is a directorate within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs which tries to implement government policies on migration. But it doesn't really, this migration, this diaspora attention that the government has brought after the 1990s, it's not really to migrant workers to the Middle East, to the Gulf countries. Like there is a racial, even in the destination countries, there is a hierarchy of migrants, it's racialized kind of hierarchy. Ethiopian migrants take the lowest in terms of payment, protection, partly because why? Migrants who go to the Middle East, not only from Ethiopia, from countries like Bangladesh, India, and other countries, they come from the lower stratum of their societies. These are poor countries which send a large number of people to these countries, the oil-rich countries who do have very good, excellent kind of relationship with the global powers. So there is not that much of an outcry if wrongs happen to migrant workers coming from Ethiopia and other countries to the Middle East. So politics is always there. And the last question is what they call $1 million question, the net losses. Yes, I don't think we can have like a balance sheet. Diaspora communities, yes, they contribute quite a lot in terms of remittances, in terms of science and technology, in terms of the high number of Ethiopian diaspora people coming back to universities, teaching, providing excellent services to our hospitals in many, many areas. They contribute quite big. But also there are also political remittances coming from the diaspora. It's not only economic and social and politically, being a political student of politics, diaspora communities tend to be much more hard line in terms of politics. Look, the Cuban diaspora in Miami and the way they play their politics. So it's a mix of a lot of things, the diaspora phenomenon. It has positive things, and it has also negative things, both economically, socially, culturally. So I don't think it would be possible to have like a balance sheet of the diaspora phenomenon, but it is not something that we can avoid. Probably it's going to increase in terms of intensity, in terms of the remittances, the social, political, cultural remittances are going to increase in the near future.
Great, thank you so much. So we have about 10 minutes. There's still 2 questions on queue. The next question is from Ali Maki, who asks, who writes, it looks like there may be room for the government to have a preparatory course for regular migrants of several days or a week to help them navigate or anticipate issues that they may encounter. This should include the lived experiences of previous migrants. Given the huge amount of remittance benefits that the government draws, there should be pressure on the government to provide that kind of prep course. Is there such a thing in Ethiopia now?
Yes, definitely there are. We visited many places. The TVT college, technical and vocational colleges, provide such training. The Ethiopian government even brought professors, teachers from the Philippines, which has a better experience than Ethiopia. But at the end, the problem boils down to this problem, to this issue. Is there any distinction between regular migrants and irregular migrants in those countries? Do the regular migrants who undertake this training, who like comply all the requirements, at the end get better treatment, better benefit in comparison to the irregular migrants? We interviewed some young people who are getting this training. They said this training takes quite a lot of time, a lot of investment. But once they arrive there, like their earlier migrants, their compatriots who have arrived to these countries earlier, there is not that much of a distinction. in terms of protection. The kafala system is there. Even if you have all this documentation, all this permits, at the end, your right as a worker, a migrant worker, is not protected. So it's not really, yes, the Ethiopian government should do better, but there must be also a realization in the countries, the receiving countries, the rights of these workers should be protected. They should get better benefits, better protection. I think it takes both the action of the recipient and the sending countries to bring better situations to the plight of migrant workers.
Sorry, I said there's a question for Sihin, and then I personally have a follow-up question to Dagmawi. Sihin, Isaias Galata writes, Sihin, thank you for the excellent presentation. Can you tell us more about the forms of resistance that you mentioned in your presentation? Do the domestic workers communicate, form solidarities, share ideas, and develop the methods of resistance you mentioned, or do they develop them in the course of their experience as domestic workers? Can you tell us about suicide as well? Would that be a form of resistance in this context?
Thank you. That's a good question. There's definitely forms of resistance that, in some cases, happen spontaneously while the women are in country, and in other instances they're learned. Again, because talking to repeat migrants, they come back here, and because they know what they've gone through, they start initiating either their younger sisters or their friends who are migrating, to prepare for what they can expect. So a few examples, teaching very basic Arabic terms to their younger sisters who are going to migrate, or their friends, or things like warning them to always have a phone with them, to hide their phones, to hide their mobile phones, because like I said, that's one of the key areas of discipline for migrants. So things like that. Language is obviously very important. When we're looking at the longer term, there's definitely resistance as an individual, but also just forming solidarity. So in one of the returnees that we spoke about forming a really close friendship with a woman who was working across the street. So they both opened their kitchen doors at the same time to be able to speak to each other. And it was really beautiful the way she described how she'd been so lonely and was so excited to hear Amharic and to form that connection basically over a kitchen door. When we're looking at more organized forms of resistance, definitely there are groups. Inyalinya is one in Beirut that have formed, and they're doing a really remarkable work. And they identify as a feminist domestic workers union, and they're working with migrants, returnees from other African countries as well. So from Sierra Leone, Ghana. So really remarkable kind of organizing. So you find that macro level of resistance and really undertaking their objection to the kafala system as well. But you find it on the micro level as well. Suicide, death by suicide as a form of resistance. I can't say I've read any research around this, and it's quite a difficult notion to think of. But definitely, it's definitely a form of objection. And we saw quite a rise in rates of suicide in Beirut recently, as you know, with the economic turndown, and there was a suicide at the rate of 1 a day or something until the government started airlifting its citizens. So I can't say there's any research around this to really try to understand if suicide is being undertaken as a form of resistance, but it's definitely a sign of desperation. Thank you.
Okay. Dagam, my question for you is, I'm curious now, I mean, at least for those of us observing from the outside, it's only recently that Italy has been associated with, quote unquote, the migration crisis. And at least in comparison with other European countries, where you have a long-standing and established migrant populations over the generations. In the UK, for instance, long-standing Caribbean and African population, right? You could say France, people from the Maghreb. In the United States, in part because of many generations standing African-American presence on which other Black immigrants like myself or other Africans can graft themselves on and also benefit from long-standing policies, right? I'm wondering, on the one hand, it's a two-pronged question. On the one hand, give us maybe a sense of how recent African migrants, their relationship maybe with a prior African diasporas and what that looks like. And secondly, maybe a personal question for you, how being a migrant in Italy and a Black person in Italy, and all of a sudden communing with Senegalese, other Africans, if it has reshaped your own sense of racial identity.
Yeah, thank you, Dagmar. The fact that Italy is a recent country who has started receiving migrants, because many Italians were migrants themselves till the 1960s. A lot of my Italians used to go and still are going to Germany or Swiss and France. So they don't have that experience as they are living in the last 20-25 years. And the way that we arrived, because I am among the people who arrived through the sea, there is for 20-25 years there is still unpreparation, and there is always the emergency that is happening. And the deal is one of the problems is that there is no relationship among the new Africans who arrive and those who had arrived some years ago. There are some communities like the Senegalese communities and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. They are strong enough to show or to help the new arrivals. And the way that those migrants arrive is much more different from those Ethiopians or Eritreans or Somalis who arrive through the sea. And there is such a gap that leaves the new migrants not to be able to orient himself or herself in the society. So my personal experience showed me the same thing, because I found myself in a new country where I didn't know nobody. So I was supposed to live in a squat for some time in Rome, and because once the service where the state is can provide you lasts only for 6 months, maximum 1 year, and then you have to be on your own. So it is a tough task to get on, and most of the new migrants want to use Italy as a passage. Like it was in Libya, many of the new migrants arriving from the sea, want to move on to the Northern Europe, where the possibility of integration due to the language and also the work opportunity, they prefer to move on to other countries, but laws do not permit them to go in such places. And regarding this last thing, how it formed me having in relationship with other Africans, when I was a kid, I studied in lycée. And the fact that it's a multicultural school helped me, and I was already inside this multicultural society, so it was easy to communicate in French or in English with the other African community here, and this is one of the advantages that I had thanks to my previous experience.
Okay, so we are right. Are you sure? Okay, so we're on the mark, but we're going to, Elizabeth Wilde-Giorgis would like to make just a very quick comment, and then I'll say my thank yous too.
I didn't have to, but I just wanted to give a brief information on, I know Dagmari, I think you're working with Dagmari Ymer. You're working with, I mean, you know Alessandro Truilsi. We had invited him for this conference, but he couldn't make it. But he's working on migration. You know, Italians came into Africa, into Northern Africa, looking for work, looking for land. You know, they came from the lower strata of the Italian society to looking for work. So he's taking that story. I mean, he's saying there's a complete amnesia of the colonial history of Italy by Italians. So he's bringing that history into the history of migration now. And trying to connect those histories together. So if you have time, I think one is from Monument to Document by Alessandro Truilsi, and a lot of other writings that he's made on current migratory problems and relating it to the Italy of the Italy of the 1930s, why they came to Northern Africa. Just wanted to give that comment.
Okay, well, I could not have asked for a better conversation. My deepest gratitude to Dagmari Ymer, to Dr. Asnaq Kafale, to Sihin Tafarra, really for educating us, illuminating things that we thought perhaps we knew, and just tuning our attention, our full attention to one of the most pressing contemporary issues of our time. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Thank you, Dagmar.
Thank you, Dagmar.
All right. Satan, do you want to come in? Yes.
Hi, Dagmar. Thank you all for such an enlightening conversation. As Professor Dagmar was saying, it's been really nice listening to you present your papers. Our next session, which is a keynote speech by Adom Getachew, titled Beyond Exceptionalism, Ethiopia and the History of International Law, will begin at 7:15 p.m. UAE local time, which is in the next 11 to 12 minutes. I would like to remind all attendees to register to attend the keynote, so you can have a login link. And for all participants in the conference, please use the panelist link that we've shared with you. Thank you again, and we hope to see you all very soon. Thank you.